Hello, Heathens. Welcome back. Thanks for coming. Today I have with me the one and only Eric J. Harvey. Hello.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thanks for joining me. Um, so I, like I do with most people that I ask on the show, found Eric on Twitter, my favorite hellscape of an app. And I was really interested in his work on disability and blindness in the ancient Near East. And so I asked him if he would come talk to me about it, and he very kindly obliged. But as always, Eric, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what led you down this path?
Sure. Yeah. So I didn't, I grew up in the Evangelical Church for the first part of my life in a sect of the church known as the Plymouth Brethren,
Oh boy.
and then moving from there into the Evangelical Covenant denomination, and then despite the fact that I focus on Hebrew Bible now, and the ancient Near East, that was not what I ever intended to do, and it was sort of a strange journey into it. Even though I started in the church, and I was a psychology undergrad, and then I got really into linguistics,
Hmm.
and then after college, I applied to several linguistics grad programs and didn't get in, and then heard about this ancient languages and cultures program, and I applied to that. Um, and from there, it was just sort of a journey into the wild world of biblical and ancient Near Eastern studies. I graduated with my PhD from Brandeis University in 2020, and am now finishing up a one-year postdoc at Stanford in the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, their Digital Humanities Center. Um, so,
Cool.
yeah, that's a little bit of my academic story. My work, I work on a lot of different things. Um, my dissertation was on the manuscript history of the Book of Psalms, and then once again, emerging from that in a way that was not intentional and I did not expect, I started to work on disability and blindness in the Bible and the ancient Near East for various reasons we can talk about. Um, and I also, have interests in sort of the Bible's reception and its political use in
Oh
the
boy.
contemporary United States.
Yeah. Okay, so there's so much I want to dig into there, but maybe we can start with this sort of taking over of our country by the Christian far right, um, and how they were able to do that. And obviously we don't have to go into the history of it, but I think there's something to be said. I think we talked a bit earlier about how they just sort of did it by force. They developed a sort of hegemony.
Yeah, I think, yeah, before we turned the recording on, we were talking about this course I taught this spring called Bible Politics and the Internet. Um, and it was a small course, and my goal in the course was to sort of bridge this huge chasm for my students between the academic study of the Bible in its ancient context, in its original languages, and what it was doing back then and where it came from and how it emerged and all of that, with the modern uh, political use of the Bible, where I understand political very broadly to mean, sort of the intentional shaping of our social
Right.
life together, more than just policy, although it certainly includes policy and political rhetoric, but also just the politics of social organization. Um, and this chasm is so huge that I think a lot of uh, academic biblical scholars, what we work on seems so far removed from
Right.
how the Bible is cited and employed and put to work uh, in the modern world that chasm is hard to bridge, and it's hard to understand what value academic biblical studies has for the Bible's modern use for students who are unfamiliar with academic biblical studies, or, a lot of my students were completely unfamiliar with the Bible in any regard. I had students who had been raised irreligious, as well as students who had been raised Catholic, Protestant, Jewish.
Irreligious, lucky them.
Yeah, well, and so it was just it was a great class, and I tried to sort of give my students a very broad understanding of the Bible's process of emergence over time, its internal complexity. And then we worked over and over again on this theme that, the Bible is not one text that has one way of reading it and one necessary meaning, right?
It's not univocal here.
No, it's not internally univocal, but also it is not
even
univocal in terms of its right, exactly. Yeah. There's plenty of, there's a huge diversity of internal voices, right? And they don't always agree with each other. Sometimes they explicitly disagree with each other. But it's also not univocal in terms of its necessary implications or interpretations, right? There's a way in which the Bible, or a Bible, since there is no one Bible, right? Bibles are anthologies and collections, and there are
don't tell the Christians
anthologies and collections, depending on which community you're a part of. So in many ways, whichever Bible you're working with forms sort of a generative base. It's not only a product of the community that reads it, but it's this generative base out of which a bunch of different interpretations and meanings can flow. And so every time you find yourself thinking that a biblical text has one meaning, one possible direction of interpretation, and then you go back in history and you find this wild profusion of interpretations, right? I was interested in showing them the diversity in the ancient context, and then the diversity of interpretations, but I was also interested in getting them to engage that question of, why do we often feel that there's one necessary meaning and one necessary interpretation? And that's where we got into this discussion of the cultural hegemony of evangelical interpretations of the Bible in the modern United States. And there are exceptions, of course. There are communities of Bible readers who read in non-evangelical ways. But in very broad terms, the public and political conversation is guided and shaped by evangelical interests, evangelical priorities, and evangelical assumptions. And they didn't get there so much by winning arguments as simply what I call the brute force approach of material overproduction, right?
Yeah. That it feels like a war of attrition.
Yeah. And there are some great books on this in terms of like the rise of evangelical publishing. There's a book called Evangelicals Incorporated by Daniel Baca, a book called Guaranteed Pure by Timothy Gloge, on the interrelationship and intermingling of early capitalist marketing with the Moody Bible Institute and its Christian publishing. And so there's this fascinating history of vibrant and profuse cultural production, from books to music to media, movies, things. I would often have my students, instead of going to the library first, I would have them do a Google search, right? Just to see what was popping up first on the first 2-3 pages of Google or of Amazon, right? And if you search for things like study Bibles, you don't find the academic ones first. You find 10 pages of top 20 lists that are populated by 20 evangelical study Bibles. The sociologist of religion, I was sort of clued into this by the sociologist of religion, Samuel Perry, who tweeted something a few years ago about, if you're reading a study Bible in America, chances are, by the numbers, that you are reading a conversation between evangelicals written by evangelicals for evangelicals, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even when you look for commentaries, you have to be careful. I was doing a study on Revelation a while back, and so I was pulling up commentaries to look at. And even though you would assume, at least I sort of did, that the commentary would be more academic and sort of less biased, you can't assume that. You can't. And so it was an interesting sort of experience to have to go through and say, like, okay, who wrote this? Are they religious? Do they address any of their biases? Which some folks did. They said I sort of ascribe to this school of thought or this school of thought. So at least I knew that going in. But there's just so much. And as you were talking, I don't know, shout out to my like 2000s kids here. When I was younger, my parents used to take me, I swear it was every weekend, to Western Christian bookstore. And everything in there, as you might tell by the name, is Christian. Books, movies, clothing, singular. And the one thing that sticks out, because it was so damn hokey, was they had breath mints that they called testaments.
Testaments, I know of them. Yeah.
I'm sorry, that is like the least academic part of this conversation, but I just could not get it out of my head because it stuck with me for like 20 years because I was just like, this is okay. And they had little crosses on them. Oh, all right. All right.
I'll one up you there because so when I was growing up, we used to get my whole family together for Christmas, and my dad would buy some like really silly like toy that we could all play with. So one year he found, do you remember Pogs?
Oh yes, I love them.
So he found these little guns that could shoot Pogs, like Nerf guns, but they would shoot Pogs. You'd load them up like a like a clip of Pogs, but like we didn't want to buy any of the expensive Pogs, and then we randomly found at the Christian bookstore just a display full of Christian Pogs that were like, that in quality they were about as good as like your standard trolling meme nowadays. They were awful. And I think I was lucky in my family, we sort of took those cultural entailments of evangelicalism very lightly. But yeah, it was just the cultural production has just been, they have outpaced and outmatched anything by any other religious community in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think something that was really important and maybe healing, and I don't know if that's the right word, but when I started leaving the faith, as anyone that's listened to me for any amount of time knows, I grew up in a very charismatic church, and I never felt these like emotional experiences everybody had around me all the time. And I was like, I don't get it. So God must not like me very much. And so eventually I got to a point where I was like, all right, I'm just going to research the Bible. And if the historical facts of the Bible can stand up to scrutiny, to research, then I'm just going to accept that it's true. I will leave the supernatural stuff out. I'll just accept that it's true. And that like, for whatever reason, God just doesn't want to do anything that I feel. And so I started reading scholarship, but I didn't just read Christian scholarship, right? I started reading sort of, I say secular. Secular gives this idea that it's anti-Christian because when you grow up in the Christian church, everything that's secular is bad, but really it's just not religious. And as I started reading, my mind was blown. One, because nothing I was taught was true. And also because people talked about the Bible without this sense of reverence, where you had to like, you couldn't question it, or if you did question it, you had to do it in the right way. But you could ask any question you wanted, and you could go find answers, and you didn't have to be committed to an outcome. And so I'm wondering what your experience was like as a scholar, an academic, if it was similar.
Yeah, and I think I assumed when I got into biblical studies in the academic sphere that it would be largely confirmatory, right?
Right.
I never had a real antagonistic or belligerent sort of culture war attitude, but I assumed that most of what I believed would be shown to be correct and deepened in the process of academic inquiry.
Right.
And I remember there's these flashpoints in my studies that I remember where I was reading some, so to be specific, I was reading a commentary on the Minor Prophets, and reading the section on Jonah, and it was by an evangelical scholar, and yet someone who was trained and knew the critical scholarship.
Right.
And so he said, Jonah maybe this is. I still remember some of the specifics of his argument, even though this was 15 years ago, 16 years ago, maybe. He said, we don't know, Jonah may be one of the earliest written prophets or one of the last. And then he made this comment that, in the excavations at Nineveh and the tens of thousands of texts excavated there, no mention of any events like this have ever been found. And I had to get up and walk around for a little bit to cool off because it wasn't so much that nothing had been found to confirm it. It was that Nineveh had been excavated and tens of thousands of texts had been found there. And as I think through it, I realized that before I started studying the Bible academically, it existed for me in this place of absolute truth, but also uninvestigatability, right?
Yeah.
And so it was more the realization that we could use the tools of archaeology and historical inquiry to, of course, Bible places were real places, but they were real with a capital R, and to learn that they were also real with a lowercase r,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah.
That was the revelation, to use a Bible-y word. And there have been a lot of moments like that where you realize that not only are the ways that many of us were raised to think of and read of the Bible not straight up reliable and accurate, but also there are so many other ways to read and think about it that lead to all sorts of generative insights and joy of inquiry.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember, so as you probably know, growing up evangelical, you are told what the Bible says, and then you read the Bible with that sort of overlay. So whatever your pastor tells you the Bible says, it's hard to separate that when you're just growing up reading the Bible, because you think, well, if the pastor said it, it's probably true. Or that's what it means. And you're also taught that the Bible is God's perfect word and it's infallible. And so you really don't, you don't feel safe questioning it, right? And especially if you're deeply indoctrinated into that, you also don't think you should question it. So having left, the Bible to me now is a much richer, more interesting document, especially since I learned about things like genres, right? When I learned about apocalyptic literature and how that evolved over time and why that evolved over time, and then you look at the timeline of the prophets and the Old Testament, and then the jump to the New Testament, it adds a complete new lens to my understanding of what the hell was going on. And because evangelicals are incredibly self-centered, they think that all these Old Testament prophecies are speaking directly to them. And so when I started to learn about the role of prophets in ancient Israel, all of that made a whole bunch more sense. And then when I started listening to Jewish scholars, my mind was blown.
Yeah, for sure.
So different.
I think even beyond the content of what's told about the Bible, there's this way in which the idea of a strong faith is constructed in evangelical communities in terms of it's a strength to withstand, right?
Right.
And this gets back to what you're talking about, the binary, sort of this dichotomy that gets created between the church and the culture, or Christian and secular, or whatever. And the idea is that to equip someone with a strong faith, quote unquote, is to equip them to go out into the culture and withstand any of its influences, right?
Right.
It is a faith that remains constant in the face of any uh, challenge or even any new information.
Right.
And and I was talking to somebody the other day, and I was like, why is that the idea of strength of faith that gets constructed in these spaces? Why is there not an idea of strength of faith that that follows inquiry in directions that are unexpected, right? Um, like that's that's another valid view of strength, but it's not
Right.
what gets it's
It's
not the ideal that gets perpetuated or
it's
reproduced.
not what keeps people in
And
line.
that's true,
Uh,
or within, within the boundaries, right?
right. Yeah.
Um,
And
and
also,
I
I
think,
mean, the having
yeah,
being able to tell people that the Bible means one thing and I know what it is, and you can't question it because it's infallible and it's God's word,
mhm,
allows folks to accumulate power and hold on to that power. And if there's something we
yes,
know is that people love power, especially people that often find themselves in those roles. That certainly doesn't mean every pastor in the world is looking to,
mhm,
get a whole bunch of power and misuse it. But I think if we look at the landscape today and throughout history, the Bible has been used and those arguments have been used to control people and to keep people in power, and to make sure that people don't fall out of line or don't, go outside the boundaries.
mhm.
Um, and to be honest, for a lot of people, it's easier just to accept what they're told, right? Because when people leave, oftentimes they're ostracized. I mean, both of my
Mhm,
parents think I'm going to hell. Uh,
mhm.
so like, it's not an easy path
Yeah.
for a lot of people. Doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. I just think that a lot of people, they think they have answers to everything.
Mhm.
And
Well,
that's a
I think there's, I mean, I think it also holds true for much less sort of clear and dramatic definitions of leaving than you have in your personal story, right?
sure.
And I think on in the community side, it's really honestly driven by sort of a deep anxiety and
Yeah.
fear. As I know you've also participated in dialogues on fear of hell, um,
Last night.
and it's not just and so there is in this sense sort of this community policing that goes on based on not only fear for yourself but fear of fear of hell for yourself but fear of hell for others and for loved ones, right?
Yes.
That is it turns concern into coercion in a way that I think deeply harms a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. I was talking about this last
Mhm,
night on a panel, and something that you're taught, at least that I was taught as a Christian, was that if you didn't evangelize or didn't take the opportunities to tell other people, that effectively their blood would be on your hands.
mhm.
And that's terrifying as a child
Yeah.
because you think you're going to go. I also don't know where I got this weird idea from, but like I was taught and everybody around me believed that we were going to have to watch like our entire life standing in front of God on like some, I don't know, giant cosmic movie screen. And so it was also this weird thing where it's like, okay, if I don't do this, not only am I going to be in trouble forever, effectively, but like I'm going to
Mhm.
have to sit back and watch after I die all the opportunities I missed. And we don't have to jump into this, but it created a compulsion. And I think I've talked to a lot of people who have left the church who struggled for a while with sort of church-induced OCD, um,
Mm.
because they're constantly feeling compelled to evangelize or confess or do any of those things. Um, yeah, it's really harmful.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I I'm not sure I have anything to add to that, but I was just thinking of a comment you made earlier about, um, and so I might transition topic if you don't
Oh
mind.
no, please do.
Um, but you said this comment earlier about how you were told, from the pulpit what the Bible said, and that
Mhm.
informs how you read the Bible when you actually open it up, right?
Right.
And I think that holds true even for people who aren't part of Bible believing communities, right? I did this exercise with my students um, after the leak of the Supreme Court decision on
Oh
Dobbs.
God.
They asked me to expand our one class session on abortion into a whole week on abortion, and we did it. And I'm glad we did. But
Absolutely.
I did this exercise where I went to all of the pro-life religious organizations I could find, found every Bible verse they cited or quoted in support of an anti-abortion position, and then put them, assigned the students to read all of them, either the verses, but if they were confused by the verses, to read it in the chapter in context,
Right.
right? And then when we got into class, I divided them up into groups, and we asked two questions. And the first one was, which of these texts actually deals with abortion? And then the second was, which of these texts deals with an ethical concern relevant to the abortion debate?
Right.
And the first answer was most of them were like, none of them. What are you talking about, right? And there I disagree with them, because I think there is in Numbers 5 instructions for inducing an abortion in certain conditions of a
Infidelity,
failed
or like
paternity
testing
test,
infidelity.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like there is no text that deals directly or especially opposes abortion. And even when we moved on to the discussion of like which texts are relevant to the abortion debate, most of them were like, some of these are tangentially relevant, but most of them have been shoehorned into the debate in a way that's wholly irrelevant, or they are only relevant if you've already decided that abortion is murder, right? Like the 10 Commandments, do not murder, is only relevant to abortion if you have already decided abortion is murder. And like, my point is not so much that, but my point is how shocked all of the students were, regardless of how much contact they had with the Bible before they got into my class, right? Some of them had grown up in church, some of them had not, but they all assumed that it had to be in there somewhere, right? There had to be some crystal clear, strongly stated, categorical opposition to abortion in the Bible somewhere. And the fact that it wasn't was a surprise to them.
Yes. I mean, every time I hear the Bible clearly says, I know I'm about to hear some bullshit, because the Bible doesn't clearly say much if you're reading from cover to cover.
And I actually remember a conversation I had early in grad school with a friend of mine who was, we were friends from high school and college, and he was evangelical. And he told me, he said, he was sort of confessing it to me. It was something he didn't tell many people, but he said, I actually don't read the Bible that much, because every time I do, it's not what I expect.
That's interesting.
And like, I think that is just such a summation of everything we've talked about, and like such a searing indictment of the rules of engagement in evangelical communities for Bible reading and interpretation.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I think there's that culture of like not questioning. So even if it's something you don't expect and you might want to ask about it, most evangelical circles don't foster a very safe environment for questioning much of anything. I mean, I think the other thing is that,
I mean, you have a belief, you open the Bible, you find it not reflected or challenged.
Right.
What's the easiest road to keep down that road and bring it up to everybody? Or, there's two other possibilities. One, to assume you're the dumb one who doesn't get it.
Right.
Or just to close the book and like keep that inside and go along on the outside, right? Like, and neither of those is optimal.
I agree. Okay. I want to get in to your article on blindness in ancient Mesopotamia. I was reading it the other night. I took like 3 pages of notes because I'm a nerd. And I was finding it so fascinating, because some of the stuff you say is very obvious, but I certainly never made that connection. And it showed me how much I view history through the lens of myself, a white, able-bodied, cisgender woman, right? And so when I first started reading the article, you talk about how most of the representations of blindness we have from antiquity are Greco-Roman. And because they wrote on parchment, things had to be copied over and over, and they had to decide what they thought was important in order to copy it. And so a lot of stories about people who were blind sort of got amalgamated into maybe one or two sort of bigger stories.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll say, so the point that I was making there is, in all ancient societies, you have texts being produced for all kinds of reasons, right? You have like stories, poems, all the, highfalutin literary texts.
Right.
You also have like receipts, grocery lists, letters, memoranda, all the stuff that is of very sort of ephemeral importance.
Right.
And so which ones are the ones that are going to get copied and preserved for posterity?
Of course. Yeah.
The literary ones, right?
Yeah.
You don't copy ration lists. You don't
Right.
copy receipts or like shipping orders.
Yeah.
And so since the Mediterranean societies wrote on parchment, once those manuscripts with those sorts of ephemeral texts deteriorated, they were gone. And that there are exceptions, right? We have papyri from Egypt from 2500 BC, but and onward. But in terms of the literary legacy of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, it is primarily texts of literary importance and with a smattering of what they call documentary sources, those ephemeral texts. And then in Mesopotamia, that you have kind of, I don't know if it's a straight reversal, but a very different proportionality, because they were writing on clay. And so like, if you have your archive of bookkeeping and accounting documents, and somebody comes and burns your city, right? When you get conquered, the clay gets fired, and then it goes under the sand, and it's preserved for 2,000 years until imperial powers come and loot. And so it's just these. I wrote this article on Mesopotamia because we get such a different gestalt image of what blindness was from these day-to-day ephemeral documentary sources than we do from these literary legends and epics
right.
of Greece and Rome. Yeah.
You talk about something called the cited imaginary, which I loved, but I would love it if you would explain to everybody listening what you mean by that, because I thought it was incredibly salient and important for people to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something that emerged out of not only my research on blindness in Mesopotamia, but in the Hebrew Bible. And I only started working on blindness in the Hebrew Bible by accident. I was working on my dissertation, and I also went blind in the middle of my PhD. So in terms of, right, I was not blind when I started my PhD, but I was.
Is it the PhD that caused it? No.
No, it's a retinal deterioration.
Sorry, it was
caused by a genetic disorder, but
just teasing about the PhD.
Anyway,
sorry.
Right. But it was that's a substantial personal, practical, emotional transition.
Absolutely.
And so I was doing a lot of reskilling in terms of learning Braille, learning assistive technology, building new workflows. And I was also just on the emotional, personal side, reading a lot of blindness literature just to sort of wrap my head around what is blindness and what are perspectives on blindness. Because like I'm overly analytical, and when I have to deal with something, I just read the shit out of it, right?
Oh, I can relate.
So
yeah, I can relate. So, one of my teachers called me out on that hard one time. They're like, "You should try feeling your feelings instead of researching them." And I was like, "Nah, I can't do that. Sorry,
I
got no time to feel them."
I feel attacked. So, but at the same time, then I started working on this sort of the literary connections between text and the Bible. There's this sort of famous phrase that gets used and reused they have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear, right?
Mm.
And interestingly, I've actually found evidence of this predating the Bible. There's a
Oh, wow.
Sumerian text that mentions it. But it appears in the Hebrew Bible in 5 different places. And I kept seeing people refer to it as blindness. And I was like, literally, only one of these has anything to do with blindness. So I started to, think through and disentangle the concept in my own mind that were going on and being conflated in the secondary literature on these texts. And then I started looking into more, the sort of metaphorization of blindness um, and the lived experience of blindness, and just thinking through it with all of the other reading I was doing on disability and blindness, from disability theory, disability history to memoir. Um, and I came to this realization that I was going to have to write on blindness in antiquity and in the Hebrew Bible because um, most of the writing on it was just not that good. Um,
I'm shocked.
and it was not that good because there was. I'm not saying you can only write well on things if you have lived experience of them, but one of the rallying cries of the disability rights movement, and rightly so, is nothing about us without us.
Right.
Because if you're not writing based on lived experience,
You're just making it up.
you're either operating out of secondhand reports or observed experience or imagined experience, right?
Right.
And as soon as I started to think with this concept of imagined experience, I realized that not only in the modern secondary literature, but also in the ancient texts, writing on blind people was done primarily by sighted people using sighted stereotypes and assumptions in this realm that I refer to as the sighted imaginary, right? And this is especially true, I think, the further you get away from uh, sort of these fastidiously factual texts genres, right? And like I think I write a whole long section where like you disability is never empirical because it's already a biopolitical construction even at the moment you ascribe a disability. But you know at least in these texts of accounting, an accountant um, isn't going to like change the job of a blind person to match a stereotype. It's going to be like, okay, we gave, um, Shemaiah the blind gardener 60 sila of barley, right? Um, and whereas when you get into genres where you have blind characters being either massaged and conditioned in their characterization for pathos and literary and narrative value, right? Then you start to move into the realm of stereotype and assumption and culturally constructed stigmatized presuppositions. And then when you have blind characters invented whole cloth, often they are going to be serving more of a symbolic and metaphorical function, or at least those resonances are always going to be there in their characterization.
Absolutely.
So for me, this idea of the sighted imaginary describes how sighted authors and composers, but also like the people copying and transmitting and editing texts are overwhelmingly sighted, and thus that they form the controlling share of people who are shaping the presentation of blind people in the literary record, especially since in Greece and Rome especially, blindness comes to have such profound metaphoric and symbolic resonances in ways that weren't necessarily true in Mesopotamia or even ancient Israel, at least not originally.
So when we look back at ancient Mesopotamia, when do we start seeing sort of records of blind workers in the economy? And why do we start seeing them at that time?
Yeah, so we start seeing blind workers in Mesopotamian economies in the Sumerian city-states of what we call the early dynastic period, which is the early to mid third millennium, and these show up really in the mid third millennium. And the reason we start to see them is because you have these smaller cities growing into larger, more administratively complex and capable city states, right? And so they are organizing larger workforces, and in order to organize large workforces within um, their institutionally based redistributive economy, they develop some pretty sophisticated accounting and bookkeeping practices that if you read, for example, books on the history of economics or accounting, you find most historians identifying the invention of these as happening in the Renaissance. Whereas if they, if they had knowledge of ancient Near Eastern texts, they would know that many of these things, such as the representation of labor in abstract terms, forecasting based on previous yields, crop quotas, double entry bookkeeping, all of these were already in play in the ED3 city states, and part of this was that the great institutions, the temples and the palaces, would have workforces of bound workers who were certainly not free, but were also not true, like they were not truly enslaved as the slaves at the bottom of society were. They sort of occupied this middle ground between, free citizens and the enslaved workers. In senses that they didn't have many social or legal rights. They had more than slaves, but they also couldn't be bought or sold with impunity. So they were bound to the institution. And these would be given these grain, oil, and raw material allotments as sort of their, they used to call them rations. Now there's a growing movement to refer to them more as a salary, depending on how you view the nature of this work and the workers, which are in many ways still unclear. But we have these huge lists of the distribution of these allotments, and they'll list the names, work groups, name, occupation, amount of barley and oil distributed. And so you'll start to see, the name of a blind person, name, blind, right, like a water drawer, and then 60 sillas of barley.
Right. I'm never going to tire of saying Iggy Nudu, by the way.
Iggy Nudu, yeah.
I just want to run around saying it all the time, apropos of nothing, but I thought it was such a fun word. And for those that don't know, because I didn't know, that's the word that they used during this period for a blind person, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And okay. I would be an Iggy Nudu. You would be an Iggy Silim for a person with healthy eyes.
All right.
Yeah, and the vocabulary changes over time, but yeah, for the early dynastic period, Sumerian, that is the term.
I saw the next term and I was like, that's not nearly as fun.
I know.
It's like, I don't even know how to pronounce this. Yeah. It's like some numbers. Right. So what kind of professions do we see the Iggy Nudu populating primarily?
Mm-hmm. Early on, it's primarily in gardening, and in particular, irrigation work, water drawing. So they would be the person at the canal or well who would, bring up the bucket and hand it off to the next person, right? It's so stationary, repetitive work, but you also find millers. Think here, for example, of the biblical story of Samson, who once his eyes get gouged out, gets sent to the mill.
Samson,
and artisans, and artisans of several kinds. As we move into what we call the Ur-3 period, which is the last centuries of the third millennium, we find texts with like a whole bunch of different occupations, and so there's still like the majority of them are either gardeners or millers, but after that you find quite a few musicians. And then after that, in terms of their proportion of the records, there are blind people in all, like one or two blind people in all sorts of occupations. You find fullers, which is laundry. You find ox cart drawers. You find shepherds, plowmen, boatmen, and all sorts of weaving women. Just a number of different occupations, more than I think anyone expected at first.
It certainly was more than I expected when I was reading it. And I think, well, one question I have is there any evidence of, I don't know, I want to say like assistive technology, but obviously, I mean, technology was not really a thing then. But did they have any aids?
I'm gonna differ with you there, because everything is technology.
Okay, fine. Yes.
There's plenty of technology. But in terms of, so there is no evidence of intentional adaptive
tools,
procedures, or alternative techniques, or rehabilitation in any sort of modern sense. There is, in one text, Enki and the World Order. There is Enki and Ninhorthaga. There is a section in there in which the god Enki disguises himself as a gardener, and in a new interpretation by Peter Steinkeller, he proposes that Enki disguises himself by dressing up as a gardener, and part of the disguise is pretending to be blind. And as parts of that disguise, he picks up a staff, right? Which is, unusual, because that's not something that is associated customarily either with gods or with gardeners, or gardening as a profession. So Steinkeller suggests that this might be early evidence of blind people using staves or canes for navigation, which I think is certainly, while there was no intentional rehabilitative adaptation going on, probably, or teaching of alternative skills, there was certainly ad hoc adaptation going on. And I think, individuals would have varied to certain extents in the number of alternative strategies for getting things done.
Right. Humans are nothing if not adaptable.
Yeah. And most people don't have the experience of going to a blindness conference, but if you get around a whole bunch of blind people, you see all sorts of ingenuity and adaptation and like skill sharing going on. And then one of the easiest and most natural things to do when you're navigating somewhere is to get some sort of arm extension, right?
Yeah.
And now we have like the very standard white cane, which operates more as a signal to sighted people that there's a blind person in their midst, or crossing the street or whatever. But like when people don't have their canes, they'll use their water bottle, or like a piece of paper, anything to extend the reach, and then sort of get a sense of obstacles in the environment without running into them.
Yeah. So something we were chatting a little bit last night, and you mentioned that there's a Hittite letter that mentions 10 prisoners of war who were blind that managed to both escape and stay gone. And I don't know that you know the answer to this, but I am intrigued by this idea that 10 folks that couldn't see managed to escape captivity and then navigate their way through the desert somehow to, I assume, they went somewhere. I hope they made it wherever they were going, but it's just so fascinating to me, because I can't imagine escaping from somewhere and I can see perfectly fine. I was wondering if you had any sort of thoughts or on that at all.
Yeah, and I think it's always fraught when you have one letter and then nothing on any other side, no other correspondence in that stream, to reconstruct what happened before or after.
Of course,
And one of my main points in this piece is that we have to consider blindness to be a diverse and heterogeneous category, right? That most blind people can actually see to some extent. It's just not enough to participate in all of the conventional cited techniques of doing all the tasks of everyday life.
Right.
But
I think
in
you
the case
mentioned that a lot
of
of people
prison,
that wear corrective lenses today would have been considered blind by ancient standards, even not so
yeah,
ancient standards, because they just can't do the day-to-day tasks that someone that doesn't need corrective lenses can do.
right. And it can be more complex than that, because somebody who is uh, extremely myopic, nearsighted and categorized as legally blind on that account today, um, could have done well in Scrabble professions in antiquity, right?
Right.
Where, especially, there have been arguments in the scholarship that some of the detail work on stamp seals is so small that it would need to be done by somebody with extreme myopia, right?
That's
That
interesting.
people with a normal range and normal focus points um, would be incredibly hard pressed to create this detail work. So it's a very, blindness is a shifting category. It's a diverse category. It's always an ambiguous category. In the case of prisoners of war, if these 10 Hittites were prisoners of war who were blinded, then chances are much better that they had zero visual perception, right?
They had
Because
zero eyeballs.
they had zero eyeballs, exactly. And this is, we find the earliest actual depictions of blindness are come in blinding, and they're these early third millennium relief carvings of conquered armies being blinded by the conquering army, right?
Gnarly.
So this is something that went on, and it's likely that they didn't have any vision at all. And in terms of their escape, there are all kinds of possibilities that could be imagined, right? In terms of they could have been very good at navigating. I know lots of people with no vision who are very good navigators.
Probably much better than me, to be honest. Couldn't find
Some
my
of
way
them,
out of a
yeah,
paper bag.
and or they could have been, since it was the mill, there could have been several totally blind people and somebody with partial vision,
Right.
or there's all sorts of scenarios you can imagine with various levels of independence or assistance. You asked earlier about aids and assistive technology. Later in the Greek or Roman world, it was very common to have a human guide, especially for wealthy blind people. Right. And I forget who it was because I'm not a Roman historian. Yeah, it was customary for especially wealthy Roman people to have sighted guides. And for the wealthy, these were often slaves. So I forget which Roman political figure said this, but somebody asked him what the practical consequences of losing his sight were, because he had lost his sight later in life, and he said, "It means I've had to get one more slave." Right? So it's very, super callous, which is sort of what you need to enslave people in the first place. But it was, and there's been work, very good work, for example, by Chris DeWitt, on slaves as prostheses in Roman society for people with disabilities, which is, disturbing, but it shows the complexity of the matrix of oppression, if you will.
Yes. I was reading recently about slavery in early Christianity by Jennifer Glancy, I think is her name. And I believe it's the Greek word that she's talking about for slaves effectively just means like body, in the same way that if you're in the military, they say like, we need 20 bodies over here, right? It completely removes the personhood from the body. They're just serving a purpose. And I thought that was a really interesting, obviously I don't read Greek, but I thought it was a really interesting insight, because as we all know, people love to quibble about slavery in the Bible for some reason. But I thought it was just fascinating. And you saying that slaves as prosthesis even more so strips the personhood away from them, and sort of just makes them a prop. I don't want to say a prop, but like
Yeah,
a
I
piece
mean,
of furniture.
it is, degrading and dehumanizing, to be sure.
Right. So I just really had sort of one more point that I wanted to touch on, and then we can wrap up because I want to be respectful of your time.
Sure.
In your paper, you talk about blind children being musicians, and it seems like there's a debate sort of among scholars of whether this was an experimental one-off or if they selected children that were born blind to go into this profession. I was wondering if you could just fill that out a little bit because I found it incredibly interesting.
Yeah, so that section was on a kingdom called Mari in the Old Babylonian period. So this is the beginning of the second millennium BCE, and we have all this internal palace correspondence that is, dealing with all of sort of the complexities of administrating a second millennium royal apparatus. And part of this is like a lot of musicians, like hundreds of musicians, and a lot of them were well, not a lot, but several letters mention quite a few blind musicians, right, or a handful. And so, it's interesting in the letters that the blind musicians were not only mentioned, but that they were, separated out from the sighted musicians in the counts given. And so there's also a letter where one of the palace officials mentions a two, or I don't know if I think it says two boys, who were. There's one letter in which one of the palace officials mentions some boys that were put into his care before they were entered into the musical ensemble, right? And the boys are referred to with an adjective, labanudum, which is kind of ambiguous. But after this, he says, on that day you said, "Why have you not put their eyes to sleep?" So I put their eyes to sleep. And so there's been a lot of controversy over on what this means, because it seems that it's talking about blinding these boys before entering them into musical training. And there's some debate because of recent developments in Sumerian linguistics. Wolfgang Heimpel has put forth an argument that for example, for a new term meaning blind in the or3 period, that in other lexical lists, which are sort of like were like lists of equivalent words between Akkadian and Sumerian, or lists of logograms for Akkadian words. This term is labanudum is equated also with this term for blindness. So one interpretation of this letter is that there were boys who could see, who were entered into musical training, who were blinded before they started musical training. And in that case, there's the possibility that this was sort of de rigueur, but there's no other evidence for the practice than this one letter. So one scholar, Nell Ziegler, suggests that while this wasn't common practice, this was a one-off, sort of an experimental treatment, reflecting this deep-seated connection that she presupposes in the culture between blindness and musicianship. And then Wolfgang Heimpel says, it's more likely that these boys were already blind when they entered the palace, and that the putting their eyes to sleep is not a description of blinding them, but of some sort of treatment, because often in the medical literature, the descriptions of both diagnoses and treatments are made in highly metaphorical language. So
right.
Letters like these, they're really enigmatic, and we're not quite sure what was going on. At some point in the process, these boys were blind and they would be students of music. But at what point in the process is up for debate. And I think it's an example where it really shows sort of the the assumptions of the scholars who are making the claims, right?
Right.
And in this case, some of the scholars directly connect this to sort of more explicit beliefs that blind people were free from visual focus and thus had a more profound and developable musical skill than sighted people in places like Greek and Rome, right? In Mesopotamia, that is never explicitly stated, even though there is another interesting myth where the god Enki again creates a blind person and sets him up as a musician in the palace. So there was definitely a cultural link between blindness and music, but whether it was practical or, symbolic, theoretical, and deeper than that in some way, it's hard to tell.
Right. That makes sense. It seems like with a lot of things, at least, I mean, I've just sort of gotten into reading sort of ancient Near Eastern history broader than just the Hebrew Bible stuff that I studied.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there's lots that we can't quite tell for sure. But I think that makes it even more interesting to hear so many different perspectives on what it could mean or what people think it means, right? And on that note, I've kept you far longer than I anticipated. So thank you for being so gracious. Thank you for coming on to talk to me. And would you, if you would like to, tell people where they can find you, how they can support your work, anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So I am on Twitter at blind_scholar. I also have a personal website, www.blindscholar.com, no underscore in that case. Well, I'm a precarious academic, so my work does need support, but unless you have a tenure track job to hand out.
If that I did.
Just find me on Twitter or go to my site and my email's on there.
Absolutely. I can vouch for his Twitter account. Very informative, very interesting. All right. Well, for those of you that haven't already, like, subscribe, do all the things, send me cookies, whatever you want. And I will see everybody next time. Bye, y'all.
Oh, shit. You done fucked up, man. Ain't nothing but a gangsta party. Y'all in deep doo-doo. Y'all in deep doo-doo. Y'all in deep